speaker named Miller. Oh, he's being recorded. Got it. Okay. And I'm going to turn things over and remind people that there are speakers in spring semester as part of our wonderful lineup of women speaking, women of color speaking in the department this year. It's been lovely, continues to be lovely. And we will have Matt Coleman, who was named advisor when she was here as an undergraduate, to be its proper introduction. Okay.
Thanks, Becky. Hi, everybody. It's here. Hi, everybody on Zoom. Welcome. Today we have a very special speaker, Dr. May Miller, Professor, actually, May Miller, which I'll have a little story about. So I've known May for 11, almost 12 years now. She took, so I've almost known May for as long as I've known other people in this room. It's been a long time. She took classes with me while she was an undergrad student in our program, and I ended up supervising her thesis work. And she did a thesis on policing and homelessness and city policies around sort of distributing homelessness in Columbus, Ohio. She completed her degree in May 2012. 13, May 2013. So you and I went to lunch after you got your diploma. We went to lunch with your parents. You were on your way to grad school. We went and we got some really bad Mexican food at the Gateway, if you remember. And the four of us, it's not even there anymore. That's right, because it's been gentrified a second time. And the four of us were chatting, and May said something very precocious, something like, "Okay, I'm going to go and get my PhD now. I'm going to become a professor, and then one day I can become your colleague." And of course, May knew how preposterous that sounded, and we both laughed, I remember, and sort of joking around. I remember meeting one day my boss. And then fast forward 8 years, right now. In that short time period, 8 years, May went to UCLA first, and then she went to CUNY, where she got her PhD. Her dissertation is titled Oceanic Groundings, and her PhD was funded with a 3-year NSF graduate research fellowship, with additional funding from the Ford Foundation, the Anapod Foundation, the African American Intellectual History Society, and the Society of Women Geographers. And also in that 8-year period, May is in the middle of a 2-year presidential postdoc at the University of California at Berkeley, which, if anyone is interested, is not as good as UCLA. And also in that 8-year period, I think Max is. And also in that 8-year period, you interviewed successfully for an assistant professorship at the University of California, Santa Barbara, the Department of Global Studies, where you start next year. And as if that is not enough in that 8-year window, you have been a visiting lecturer professor, you have done a visiting postgraduate research position in Glasgow, you've been an educator at the Museum of the City of New York, where you have designed and taught classes, and you have co-curated exhibits at the London Metropolitan Archives on Afro-Caribbean activism and on Black bookshops in the United Kingdom. And now, because you're in Columbus, you have so much free time on your hands, you are teaching a class at CCAD for art and teams and identity. You're curating exhibitions on racial capitalism and algorithmic violence at Apex Art and at the EFA Project Space in New York City. You're working with the Studio Museum in Harlem on how museums can use exhibits to talk about racial justice and equity. And you're writing, and you're also apparently getting married. Yeah. You got married. And so it's just an incredible 8-year trajectory. I mean, it's a stunning 8-year trajectory, and I'm super happy to have been like a small part of it. I went back and I read my rec letter that I wrote for you, and I just want to read out the last sentence in there. I said, quote, "I really encourage Ruthie and Cindy to give me a call if any questions arise about May's application. It's a pleasure to be able to write a letter like this. I don't imagine undergraduate students or graduate students like this coming along very frequently during my career, probably never again. May has a very bright future ahead of her, and hopefully your department can be a part of that." And I just want to say, Ruthie or Cindy, if you're watching this later, I was right. And in fact, I probably wasn't right enough. It's a very impressive trajectory. So we're very happy to have you here. Nate. Welcome back. And look forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you for that introduction. It's funny. So the only thing that I remember about that lunch with my parents is being absolutely mortified because my parents told Matt this story about me getting blackout drunk at a toga party my first year, and how they were genuinely worried that I was not going to actually graduate from OSU. So they went into vivid detail about this time that I had lost my phone and it was in the rain, and I tried to call them, but then my phone broke, and I came home to my dorm in a campus cop car where I headed all over and it was on academic probation for the beginning of my freshman year. So I'm glad that you remember the positive professional dreams that I managed to share. Because I really have been thinking through oh my God, my parents told my secrets to my professors and now I laugh. And I'm well, I did it. Through grad school too. Nobody gets through grad school without those stories, or I don't know, I don't know those people. Yeah, I mean, it is. Oh, the other thing I was going to say is UCLA might be a little bit better than Berkeley, but I still tell everybody that gender studies at UCLA is the best place to study geography in the state of California. And I'm going to say maybe global studies now at Santa Barbara. So, yeah, it is incredibly surreal to be in this room again. I had started writing out some of the memories that I have of being in this room. And then it got too long and dramatic, but I'm just going to reel some of the memories that I have off anyway. I took my first class with Becky. It was the Environment and Society 400 level, the beginning of my sophomore year in this class. And I kind of stumbled into geography like a lot of people from international studies and poli-sci. And even though it was an accident, I think the way that I got here, I knew that I was curious for and hungry for the kinds of analysis of power that geography offered in the coursework that I wasn't getting from poli-sci, international studies, even history at the time. And so from that first class with Becky, I really went all in. I took 2 or 3 geography classes every semester, every quarter. I don't know, there was a switch sometimes. I took grad seminars with Matt and Nancy. I remember defending my undergrad thesis in this room. I remember taking Joel's development class during the Occupy movement, where it seemed like all of the student activist leaders on campus were somehow in that same classroom at the same time, and how transformative all of that was to my trajectory. And I was thinking a lot because I grew up, I think some of you might know this about me, but I grew up in rural Ohio, as far from anything called Oceanic as maybe possible, in a very working class military family. So I had my first foray into activism was at 15, alongside my mom, my aunts, and my grandmothers, as a factory that auto factory that they were working at closed down. And it was really through geography classes that I came to understand that history of economic restructuring, uneven development, that I came to understand why places like the community that I grew up in were so militarized, why nationalism and patriotism were just in every single thing. And as a nerdy kid who loved books and was good at social studies, there was no outlet that wasn't patriotism, essays and debate contests through the veterans of foreign wars. I was voted the most patriotic student in my class in 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade. I was so patriotic that I got to be the one to put the wreath on the tomb of the unknown soldier at our Arlington National Cemetery. And I wasn't patriotic. I just really cared about learning about politics and government and those kinds of things. And I think it was through some of these classes that I really started to get the language for understanding myself in relation to my scholarship, in terms of developing a sense of community engaged political activism, consciousness formation. And I kind of, was debating if I wanted to start with, that kind of personal intellectual journey, but I think it's so important because so much of my research is really trying to understand collective political biographies, how people came to understand themselves as part of broader collective struggles, how political knowledge and solidarities were forged across borders. And I think for me, it was like, for some reason, I'm still kind of working through, like, it was so easy for me to see these connections with militarism, with like class consciousness much sooner before I came to identify as a feminist, or before I came to see anti-Blackness operating in the world. And so, I think for somebody who identifies strongly with intersectionality and with interlocking oppressions, but has never really been able to, there was a process of seeing one strand before the other, before I could come back and see that they were connected. And so, I'm always interested in what that process looks like for others, what that has looked like through time and across space. And, when I teach my students, I start with these really vulnerable places of like, when I got to OSU, I was very proud of the fact that my classmates and peers in rural Ohio called me white. I had a very heated conversation with my moral scholars mentor about it was because I wasn't like other Black people. I really had clung to and internalized some of that stuff. But it's like, by the end of that first year, I was reading Fanon. And so if I can start at Whitey and then gradually unpack that with the support of professors, with student comrades and mentors from across the city and the campus, then I really believe that everyone has that potential to think differently about conditions that they otherwise have taken for granted. So yeah, there's a very storied history of this room, of the people in this room. Thank you to everyone who is here on Zoom and physically in person. I am going to talk today about my dissertation research, which I am learning to talk about as a first work project. And yeah, this is the first time that I've given a presentation in person. And yeah, it's kind of wild. First time in person. First time with a mask. I haven't had to do teaching during this postdoc. So that is, well, I haven't had to teach students. I teach fourth grade, which is its own fun. But yeah, I am going to start, I've adapted versions of this talk from some of the job talks that I gave last fall, as well as some other shorter presentations. But I want to start with figuring out how to use this.
Put it at the computer. It was. I wonder if it's in Zoom.
Yeah, I think you need to move the mouse back onto PowerPoint. Yeah.
You try that.
The battery might be dead. Again, COVID, all this. Oh, no,
It does really
yeah, so it was a PowerPoint thing.
So the overarching question that really has guided my research through my early time at UCLA as a grad student and through CUNY, and I think really developed also as an undergrad, is how is a close attention to the intellectual traditions and everyday spaces of ordinary people, and in the case of my book project, maritime travelers and seafarers from across the British Empire and within anti-imperial social movements, how do these knowledges chart new conceptual and empirical itineraries for trans-regional approaches to area studies and the transnational study of social movements? I realize now that I have some of that language in a very specific job talk, but I'm interested in the kinds of everyday practices and spaces that political knowledge is formed, and different ways of thinking about solidarity and knowledge production that these center the kind of editors, like big figure, charismatic leader figureheads. And so when I talk about this research, the first question that always comes up for me is why sailors, why maritime? There's always a sort of like, oh, you study pirates, right? No, you study something about the ocean. And so for me, when I started my dissertation coursework, when I got to CUNY, I took a class in the fall of my first semester. And what I was trying to do in this history course was really think about longer histories of global Black solidarities that could help us to understand what was going on with Black Lives Matter globally at the time. And so in this lit review paper, where I was working through the interwar period, I kept coming across these references to networks of radical sailors who are circulating newspapers for Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, for African communist organizations, who are thinking, both about people who are descended from Black communities, African communities, but also thinking about the kinds of multiracial solidarities and alliances that these workers were trying to forge in their everyday lives. And so the question immediately for me is, who are these sailors? Is there more written about them? Is there enough in the archives to tell their stories? So 7 countries and 14 archives later, the answer is yes. The answer is yes. And the answer is also that distributing these newspapers is just the tip of the iceberg. The stories demonstrate more broadly that internationalist solidarities and sensibilities were neither the inevitable outcome of transnational labor mobility. So where some of these workers are written about, it's like, oh, because they're moving, they're politicized in a particular way. And that must mean that they're the natural thought in terms of how ideas, information should be moved at the time, but really unpacking that, how are these people politicized? What are their different stakes in relation to different ideologies and struggles? And at the same time, these workers and travelers did not simply distribute already preformed ideas across space and time. And so my project is really trying to unpack, drawing on Black feminist historians such as Deo Gore and Barbara Ransby, Black geographers such as Catherine McKittrick, theorists such as Cynthia Hartman. It's really trying to bring to life the everyday social spaces of different port cities in order to understand what these everyday seafarers, most of whom we don't know the names of, whose stories are kind of overshadowed by names such as CLR James, Marcus Garvey. What do they tell us about broader movement building? Two. My first book project, Oceanic Groundings, Radical Internationalism and Black Feminist Journeying Through Insurgent Seas, explores storytelling, everyday spaces of world making, and the formation of Black political cultures across the British Empire from 1919 to 1945. Rather than, let's see. So rather than rigidly delimit the area of study according to boundaries of race, region, national origin, the project journeys with the life paths of maritime travelers and laborers across oceans and through alleyways in order to show how these categories were constantly contested, refashioned, and unsettled in everyday life by ordinary people, as well as the colonial administrators who legislated the production of difference and the management of circulation. The project journeys to Marseille on British ships as West Indian seafarers discuss Black nationalist politics and imperial shipping with dock workers from Senegal, and with Indian seafarers who, after deserting from British ships in New York City, had to confront the shifting landscapes of racism in relation to anti-Blackness in the United States and indentured labor in Trinidad. It considers the ideological challenges and material labor of adapting a theatrical play about multiracial dock worker solidarity against a New Orleans lynch mob for a London stage. I show how the play, shaped largely by African women's labor in the London docklands, informed the early political development of figures such as Kwame Nkrumah, and inspired African-American activist Islanda Robeson's political journey from London to South Africa. Finally, the project journeys with the lesser studied laborers and travelers through coaling stations in Cape Verde and the cabins of Black domestic workers who accompanied elite families to Cairo and Calcutta. To stretch the conventional coordinates of imperial shipping and bring new modes of relationality, exchange, and geographical knowledge into focus. What I want to emphasize now is that what holds these seemingly disparate examples together, besides their relation to an imperial state, is that each case is an example of what I am calling oceanic groundings. Throughout the book, I develop oceanic groundings in two ways. First, as a constellation of creative acts of political learning and world making by ordinary people in dockside districts. Just because people travel does not mean that they, quote, see injustice. And just because people experience injustice does not mean that they come to understand themselves as part of a shared struggle. Oceanic Groundings builds upon the work of geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore to show, and I'm quoting Ruthie here, how those who lack resources but do not necessarily lack resourcefulness figure out how to stretch or diminish social and spatial forms to create room for their lives. It is about the active and collective practices of stretching, politically, creatively, intellectually, through which maritime communities made a life in and through struggle and position themselves as the connective tissue for transnational social movements. Second, I develop oceanic groundings as a methodology for mapping, listening to, and learning from the intellectual traditions and storytelling modes of ordinary people. To engage with the depth and complexity of maritime social worlds requires an errant practice of reading across genres and repositories, of considering how literature can give form to memoranda from the Board of Trade, and how an ethnographic attentiveness to how and where a play was staged and a song was performed. At the scale of a cafe and within specific geographical contexts can shed new light upon Black cultural productions and the production of space. Oceanic Groundings builds upon alternative materialities of the maritime from the vantage point of grounded, street-strolling Black intellectuals of the interwar period. Historian Eula Taylor argues that Elva Baker and Amy Ashwood Garvey developed their political consciousness predominantly through informal study groups and practices of strolling in the streets of Harlem. Although these women had different political agendas, they shared a common commitment to gathering and sharing analysis derived from the lived realities of Black communities and developed through intentional arts of movement. Studies at the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, often focus on the spectacle of large international conventions and parades held in Harlem, overshadowing the quieter and no less powerful work of members such as Amy Ashwood Garvey, who walked door to door in the streets from Harlem to Brooklyn, extolling her Pan-African vision and building an army of grassroots foot soldiers. Likewise, Ella Baker pursued her education in the streets of New York and absorbed the groundswell of ideas surrounding her, as she spent her weekends strolling as late as 3 a.m. and listening to discussions, debates, and talking with people in red lights. Strolling was not an aimless act of wandering, but a structured and intentional act of learning on the move. Oceanic Groundings is a provocation to consider how thinking with and learning from the groundings and the people standing around talking about politics can inform the study of ocean worlds and vice versa. It is an attentiveness to how people on ships, on docks, and in oceanic social worlds on land pick up something here, something there, and move on, much like the sea washes over grains of sand, to the unanticipated cracks, crevices, and corners where ideas take hold and people hold one another, and to the ways that ports were constantly contested and remade as spaces of learning in and for struggle. Oceanic Groundings orient attention towards the clandestine and hidden in plain sight cartographies of struggle, that which is unremarked yet inescapably present. For those who are willing to look and listen, the insurgent Black spatial practices of those who are, I'm quoting Captain McKittrick here, intimately aware of surroundings, albeit on different terms than we may know, reveal liberatory ways of knowing and being. When we look to the lives of colonial seafarers, what we find is a capacious and provisional transnational infrastructure, stitched together lyrically and materially by stories, whispers, and winks. The collective practice of learning that are routed through the transitory and clandestine harbors of kitchens and basements defy premature death and the perpetual rendering of the friendless and abject subject. Their capaciousness lies in the creative combinations of people and resources to sharpen and share knowledges formed in cafes that are also classrooms, in streets that double as schools, of religious tracts that shroud freedom papers, anti-colonial and abolitionist periodicals, and of lighthouses that to the untrained mind are nothing more than darkness and detritus. Let me now turn to a more detailed discussion of these lighthouses in everyday lives. Edward Burroughs' painting depicts an ordinary scene from the Marseille waterfront. In his semi-autobiographical novel, Banjo, Jamaican writer, activist, and dock worker Claude McKay describes the cafes of Marseille waterfront, of the Marseille waterfront as sites of pleasure, political exchange, and community formation. It was there that seafarers from across the African It was there that seafarers from across the African diaspora informed each other about the shifting landscape of immigration policies and labor policies across the French, British, and American shipping systems. It was where they labored and leisured throughout the nights, and it was where they developed a sense of community. And so what I do with this painting and what I like about it is that it really shifts the focus to the kinds of socialities that are happening at the bar between the women, the possibilities for solitude and reflection. And it helps us to really think about the fact, the sort of relationality between the exterior, what's happening outside of the window, there on the docks with the shipping, with the workers who are loading and unloading. But it also gets us to understand the underlying social relations that are underwriting and making possible those kinds of transnational circuits. So in some ways, the painting is really interesting because it decenters the dock as a space of sociality in everyday life. And I think that that's what I'm trying to do with the project. And so when I think about the painting with Edward Burroughs, it's really also that kind of epistemic shift to thinking about what's happening inside the cafe and how that connects to what's happening on the docks and on the ships. Trying to find this one page that seems to be this. Page 2. Anyway, so this slide was where I was trying to explain some of the social, economic, geopolitical context of this period that I chose between 1919 and 1945. And what I'm trying to do in that time is to think about how the connections between major labor unrest among plantation and dock workers in the Caribbean, the unrest amongst soldiers and seafarers who had served in World War I, but had realized that the kinds of promises of citizenship, of liberal citizenship and inclusion had not been extended to the colonies and to racialized communities. How those articulated with the kinds of anti-colonial dock worker activism that were happening in Britain. And so at the time, both American, British, and French shipping empires depended upon underpaid, hyper-flexible, hyper-exploited labor forces. And so in my project, there is quite a bit of work that's been done in some of these historical contexts that's really going through detailed accounts of the kinds of violence, premature death, violence, malnutrition that these workers faced. And so my project is really thinking about how to revisit the engine room, not so much to reproduce the same narratives. There's already a written extensive account of this violence, but to think about some of the kinds of intimate storytelling possibilities, connections that really derive from these intersections, interstices. Yeah, I say that word. And so, you know, the writings, so transitioning from some of the broader historical context, the writings of C.L.R. James give a sense of just how important the waterfront was to social movements during this period. So in a 1987 interview in Socialist Platform, the revolutionary historian and activist C.L.R. James reflected upon his role in anti-colonial and anti-racist movements in the 1920s to 1930s. In 1936, James co-founded the International African Service Bureau with other Black radicals from across the diaspora, and this was based in London. Among these were the Jamaican activist and performer Amy Ashwood Garvey, the Barbadian seafarer Chris Jones, and the Trinidadian labor organizer George Padmore. The organization developed out of solidarity mobilizations in response to the Italian occupation of Ethiopia, but the mission quickly expanded to confront, quote, the whole imperialist domination in Africa and everywhere else. When asked about the group's efforts to circulate the organization's periodical, International African Opinion, James explained, you can see on the quote on the slide here, we tried all the ways, we couldn't get it in normally because of the colonial governments, and those that came in afterwards were quite hostile to us. We had one or two people who worked on the waterfront. They gave the pamphlets to the seamen and the people in boats. In this way, it went around. It was people like Chris Jones who would get the pamphlets, make contact, and would send it around, and to my astonishment and delight. After all, we were but a few intellectuals in London and could not have done much. James's reflections reveal important dimensions of transnational movement building in the early 20th century. It was only through networks of maritime workers that just a few intellectuals in London were able to scale up their efforts and build mass movements across national and colonial borders. While the names of people on the waterfront are not as well known as the likes of C.L.R. James or Marcus Garvey, James acknowledges that their actions were central to this struggle. Their movements as a transnational workforce enabled and advanced movements for self-determination, economic equality, and racial justice. The specific and strategic position of Black seafarers was succinctly described in the pages of the International African Opinion, from the quote that's on the slide. Seafarers spread the word either through newspapers, including the Negro World, Negro Worker, or the Kadar, or by word of mouth. Print media and street orators were primary mode of consciousness raising during this period, and the records of the colonial officials and social movements indicate that recruitment among waterfront workers was central to the transnational strategy of most major political organizations during this period. Newspapers were usually read aloud in groups, and copies were passed from person to person. Approaching the archive, not only for examples of how seafarers circulated materials across geopolitical borders, but also to understand where these materials were shared and debated in the city, in grocery queues, living rooms, dockside cafes, and with whom, presents an alternative mode of mapping and indexing how discourses of internationalism traveled. That is, how they were translated, disseminated, and formulated and debated in transnational contexts marked by difference. And I'm thinking with parentheses and words there. Court districts were not vacuums, and the kinds of antagonisms and approvals expressed in this passage on this slide are important both for how seafarers were politicized, as well as for gauging the broader reach of their stories and struggles. For the Feminist International, maritime circuits not only shaped the strategic plan for mass movement building in Africa, but also provided ways to transport activists to Moscow and to circumvent passport restrictions. This point is really important because we can understand the maritime not only as about those individuals with a long history of work on ships and docks, but in some cases, organizers from other industries worked their way onto ships in order to broaden their political mobility. One such example that I discuss in Oceanic Groundings is the South African educator Albert Nzula, who in 1930 sought work on a ship in Durban in order to eventually make his way to a port in Russia and eventually make his way to Moscow. The soft hands and awkward demeanor of Nzula and his comrades raised suspicion amongst the port authorities, and the plans faltered. Several months later, Nzula caught a ship, this time disguised as a choral singer. He made his way to London and then to Moscow. In the first chapter of Oceanic Groundings, I use this story, along with memoirs and intelligence reports on Clyde McKay, M.N. Roy, and others who shaped communist platforms on racism and colonialism, to illustrate the kinds of iterative, collective, and creative learning through port cities that shaped the creation of grand strategies in Moscow. While Nzula's story illustrates the iterative process of learning how to get hired onto a ship, Amir Khan's memoir provides compelling examples of how sailors learn to jump ship. In his memoir, Chains to Lose, Life and Struggles of a Revolutionary, Pakistani seafarer Amir Khan described his experience of jumping ship in New York Harbor in 1918. Khan was among the countless seafarers who signed on to British merchant ships on restrictive Lascar contracts for South Asian seafarers. He joined a vessel in Bombay. In New York, Khan and a fellow crew member jumped ship after a Jewish shopkeeper on the Lower West Side explained that the pair could get higher wages and slightly better working conditions on American ships. The practice of desertion was quite common, and as media studies scholar Vivek Wald has extensively documented, many Bengali seafarers made their way back to Harlem, where they formed communities of resistance with Puerto Ricans and Black people from the U.S. South and the Caribbean. Khan and his comrades told their shipmates that they were going for a stroll and never returned to the ship. Eventually, after looking for several hours, the pair found accommodations at a small lodging house in Manhattan, where, quote, though it was past midnight, a middle-aged Negro woman in her dressing gown showed them a large clean room on the second floor with a double bed and other essential furnishings. Seeing that they were strangers and poorly dressed, she asked for only $1 for the night and $5 for the week. They explained to the woman that they had left a ship to which they did not want to return. As such, it was necessary for them to remain indoors while the vessel was still in port, so that they would not be apprehended and taken back. The woman agreed and, quote, arranged for another young Negro girl who was living in the room on the same floor to purchase food, bread, butter, eggs, which they cooked in the house. Following his flight from the British Merchant Marine, Khan connected with New York-based members of the Goddard Party and went on to forge solidarity with Irish nationalist struggles, as well as the Black nationalism of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, as he spoke with workers in laundries, factories, and on the waterfront. The actions of the unnamed Jewish shopkeeper and the African-American boarding house attendants embody a politics of solidarity among ordinary people that extends beyond the more familiar cartographies of maritime struggle through intimate spaces and relations of social life. Their stories index an unremarked yet inescapably present provisional and provisioning infrastructure of care. These collective acts and subtle gestures are important on their own terms as alternative modes of mapping and making place. At the same time, these spatial practices are important and significant insofar as they enable and underwrote the more readily visible forms of maritime anti-imperialist politics, as they contributed to the making of politically conscious seafarers and the movements of pamphlets. Starting Khan's story from the accounts of the unnamed accomplices who helped and harbored as he fled from the ship, rather than the more prominent Indian and Irish nationalists who we met in the city some months later, reveal the complex and multivalent routes through which seafarers became politicized and through which political knowledge of the city, the sea, and the antinomies of imperial shipping was stretched and circulated by a range of actors who might not have had direct ties to political organizations, but whose actions supported the service of liberation struggles. Returning to the initial passage from C.L.R. James, my work provides a fine-grained analysis not only of how the ideas of a few intellectuals in London, or Moscow or New York, made their way around the world, but further uncovers a host of intellectuals from domestic workers to boarding house keepers to sailors whose labor and knowledge of the sea, the city, and struggles for liberation underwrote maritime movements. African-American activist and anthropologist Islanda Robeson's memoir, An African Journey, is another instructive text that explores shipboard solidarities in the interwar period. Her journey with her 8-year-old son, Polly, spanned from May to August of 1936. The pair boarded the SS Winchester Castle from England, from Southampton, calling at Madeira, then Cape Town, and Port Elizabeth in South Africa. With comrades in South Africa, the pair traveled by car to conventions, mining compounds, and cultural centers before traveling via train to present-day Mozambique, and later through Cairo and back to Europe. As Lee Rayford has argued, Robeson chose to look and write with political commitment and human solidarity, and portrayed Africa as a heterogeneous, living, breathing place in struggle and in formation, which challenged both the pathologization by racial scientists and the romanticized mythical narratives of a timeless Black homeland that were prevalent throughout Black nationalist movements. An African Journey begins in London, where Islanda lived for a time with her husband, the actor and activist Paul Robeson. It was in London that she came to understand the complexities of the global color line. She explained that while she was quite knowledgeable about the Negro question in America, she had much more to learn about the oppression of Black people in Africa and the West Indies. To learn about these histories, she began asking questions everywhere and of everybody. She read everything she could get her hands on. She went to the British Museum, the House of Commons, the London School of Economics, and with her husband, she began to seek out all of the Africans they could find everywhere. She says, in England, Scotland, Ireland, and France, in universities, on the docks, and in the slums. She explained that only much later did she come to realize that the so-called Negro problem included the 390 million Indians in India, the problem of the 450 million Chinese in China, as well as the problem of all minorities everywhere. Despite the initial surprise about the global scope and complexities of the color line, Robeson ultimately described the gradual unfolding of this process as a strength rather than a deficiency. Her journey reflects the conscious composition and complex choreography of movement, experience, and inquiry, through which she continued to refine her awareness of the violence of global racial capitalism. On the SS Winchester Castle, Robeson's conversation with an African nursemaid in South Africa who was minding Samir. Robeson conversed with a Xhosa nursemaid from South Africa who was minding some European children. The nursemaid told Islanda stories about the brutality of the Afrikaans against the Africans and the government effort to, quote, pit hate colors against the natives, while also not giving the colors any real rights. The conversation unsettled Robeson's understanding of racial spatial oppression and deepened her understanding of the historical specificities of racial formation. Robeson and the African nursemaid's conversation indexed subversive politics of Black storytelling. Even though this shift was primarily facilitating the movements of agents and architects of empire, these women created spaces of radical learning and intimacy across racial and colonial divisions. As Lana Robeson's memoir provides insights into the travel of other Black and subaltern women, the nursemaids and domestic workers that colonial officials depended on and whose intimate place in the colonial domestic sphere in some cases brought them into different proximity with working women on the move. In An African Journey, as Lana describes the conversations that she had with a comrade in Alice in the Eastern Cape province. Among these were Ms. Soga, a Xhosa social worker, Masha Loga, a teacher and agronomist, Max Jurgen, who directed the mission efforts of the YMCA and by night taught literacy and revolutionary theory to African workers at underground communist schools in Johannesburg, and Dr. R.T. Bokwe, a member of the African National Congress who had previously studied medicine in Edinburgh. The group discussed topics including education in South Africa and the United States, Indian independence, the Spanish Civil War, the imperialist ambitions of Japan and Italy, and the latest developments in agriculture and irrigation. Of these conversations, Robeson wrote, quote, "Big talk, challenging ideas, enthralling discussion. The walls of our world moved outward and we caught a glimpse of things in the large. Maybe we didn't solve anything. Maybe we couldn't, but at least we could know what was going on. To be aware was to be alive." For Robeson, this iterative process of talking, listening, and the movement of walls was full of possibility, and yet made no guarantees toward resolution or destination. Throughout the text, she recounts the ways in which her understanding of racial capitalism, diasporic solidarity, relationality, and the process of learning itself, was shaped and refashioned through movement across the turbulent depths of the South Atlantic, in the seaports of West and Southern Africa, and between homes and schools throughout the Union of South Africa. The text consistently elaborates a way of knowing and being in the world that challenged the material and metaphorical walls of language, nationality, and region, not to flatten difference, but returning back to Gilmore, to find the inherent contradictions in these regimes of dispossession and build something better through serious, militant, and dialogical study for struggle. My hope is that listening to the Oceanic Groundings of Khan, Nzula, Robeson, and James can help us to think differently about the stories we have heard and told about the unfinished struggle for Black freedom. Stories about people whose movements made the movement possible, the routes and reverberations of political consciousness, and the places where workers with seemingly insurmountable differences of ideology and identity made common cause, however ephemerally, in the struggle for collective liberation. Thank you. I'd like to open it up for questions now.
Yeah.
Students first,
Students first, just let me figure out how to do this.
you can stop share.
All right.
And then anybody, people are welcome to turn their cameras back on. There's George. Does George have a question?
So for George.
And people can do it in the chat, but then we'll have to show the chat.
I do have a question.
We'll go for it.
Can you hear me clearly, or what's the level of clarity?
We can hear you great.
Great. Really wish I could be there, but alas, I am phoning in from home. And May Miller, thank you for gracing our department on this Friday. So I was kind of finishing up some notes here on my question. Maybe there's not much here, but this is kind of what it brought to mind. So I kind of see what you're talking about as a reclaiming of the Black Atlantic and the meanings that are kind of so intensely associated with the Middle Passage and the transatlantic slave trade. And your work pays attention to this, a Black production of anti-colonial spatial meaning. So I'm wondering, this brings to me personally to mind, wondering if you can comment at all on some of the revisionist mythology that of the Middle Passage, like this idea of the Black Atlantis, and how art and science fiction, music can contribute to this remaking of meaning of this space. And if that rings any kind of bells, if any other comments come from that, I'll just stop talking there. Thanks.
Thanks, George.
Yes. So you can come up here. Great.
I'm just gonna stay up here. for
Yeah.
Q&A. Weird box, but I can't see anymore. Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really, really great question. And so often, so the question of the seminal text of the Black Atlantic often comes up in the Q&A. And so in my writing, I do engage with that extensively. But I think that with the Black Atlantic, there's the metaphor and the chronotope of the ship and the motion, but there is actually much less sustained discussion of the everyday lives of seafarers. And so I think that for me, I see my work as starting from that place of thinking about the different relationships that the Black diaspora has had to labor, to property, to various Middle Passages throughout space and time. And so of course, none of that can be divorced from the passage, from transatlantic slavery. But I also think that, focusing on these different moments, whether it be the late 19th, early 20th century, these different ways that those circuits were repurposed and refashioned towards different kinds of political imaginations, building on the kind of subversive revolutionary history of the Atlantic in the 17th and 18th century that, people like Marcus Rediker, people like Christina Sharp have explored, Julia Scott in different ways. And so actually, I have been thinking a lot about the art questions. I'm putting together a show where one of the artists, Edgar Arsenault, who's based in LA, does this really cool rereading of Drexia, the mythical world of children born to slaves who had jumped ship, Middle Passage, that had this kind of revolutionary underwater world, was reimagined in relation to Detroit and Lake Michigan. And so it's a really cool play on territoriality, and thinking across these kinds of borders, but also thinking about these sorts of looped, palimpsestic histories of struggle, resistance, abjection, futurity, representation that I think, I think that within some of the artistic works that I've been really drawn to, there's some really interesting pieces that are thinking about kind of overlapping and intersecting histories of enslavement and indenture through the Oceanic, thinking about alternative modes of storytelling, playing with the speculative. So the short answer is yes to the project of reclaiming and reimagining. But I also think that, there's also the question of what is the archive that we're looking for? And so, the archive in the period sort of as a historical mark of transatlantic slave trade, has very different limits in terms of what's being written, like the slave ledger log versus, in a period where there are a lot of radical activists who are telling their stories. And then there's the epistemic question of like, how are we moving through those times? But I think that art kind of finds a different way to engage some of those impasses and inconsistencies in the archive across space and time in really interesting ways that I'm continuing to think about. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you.
We have another question from our Zoom audience.
Ask one.
Go ahead, please, yes.
Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to reading your book one day. And I'm really happy to attend your talk on the day when the farmers' protest in India has achieved a major victory. So it's cool to like maybe talk about the Gather Party and that as well. I think, I think I'm curious as to like how you bring your work into your teaching, because it sounds like all the things you're into are quite interconnected. And then, just what it was like kind of diving into all this like rich archival material.
Okay. I'm going to start with the archive and then work back to the teaching. I think that, I'm going to do that. So, I mean, I really did start out with, I genuinely wasn't sure if I was going to be able to find enough material in the archives to be able to do this project. And I remember, I had just read Lisa Lowe's Intimacy of the Four Continents in a grad seminar, and I'm like, right, you're supposed to go to the archive and you're supposed to look at a bunch of random stuff, and then eventually you'll find the connections that you didn't know that you were looking for. And that was what my first trip to London was. It was like keywords for seafarers, dock workers, anything that came up. And I would find that in the Board of Trade. There was a lot of work in like the archives of like welfare reformers and the kinds of like public health. It's like, where do you find poor people? It's usually like, okay, in the hospital records, it's in the police records. And then, like once I got to London, I realized that like a lot of the labor struggles were much more multiracial and brought together a lot more overlapping histories of imperialism than I was expecting. And so then, thinking about, okay, I can't actually study African descended seafarers without thinking about like, okay, the Colored Colonial Seafarers Organization brought together workers from what is now Yemen, what is now Pakistan, what is like all of these different places. And also even when I'm reading the archives of colonial officials and these kinds of Board of Trade records, it's like when they say Black, it could mean it could be anybody who's racialized. And it's like sometimes Somalis are Black, sometimes they're not Black. Sometimes, like a lot of these policies for Black seafarers were about like started specifically in response to immigrants from Aden and Yemen, and then were expanded to be more explicitly targeted towards Caribbean seafarers. And so I think that honestly being in the archive was extremely overwhelming at first, just because it was like every time I thought I had a handle on what the category was, what the limit was, there was something that was constantly, calling that into question. And I think that eventually I just accepted that that was part of the richness of the research, right? It isn't to have a like, and this is how everyone defined race. It's like each of these seafarers through their different encounters with administrators, through their travels, like came into these different understandings, different kinds of relationality. And it's like, in the talk, I spoke a lot about, like solidarity. There's a lot of seafarers who came, like from different parts of the world encountered different seafarers, and then they just had like antagonism struggle. They didn't get along, you know, and it's like, I think that part of what has and is taking longer in terms of thinking about the book is like wanting to actually engage with those really difficult histories of like, okay, well, what did Orientalism look like among these workers from Southern Africa or from the Caribbean? Like, what did anti-Blackness look like in some of these Indian labor struggles? Sometimes they come together and it fits really nicely, and sometimes it's like, no, this is really a kind of particular nationalism that's doing different things. And so, I mean, I think in my teaching, I really try to, I try to choose readings that like engage some of these complexities and contradictions kind of head on. And actually so far, so I've taught a couple classes at Vassar, which is interesting because it's definitely a predominantly white institution. And the students who come to my class are always first-gen students of color, like from all over the world, who are like, oh shit, I've never had a professor bring up like say Guyana in class, let alone assign a reading, or like I've never seen like my transnational experience of Blackness depicted. And so, I mean, I think, a lot of my teaching now going into global studies will continue to sort of think through, the transnational politics of difference. I bring a lot of archival documents into my classes. I've tried that with the high school students that I teach at the Museum of the City of New York. There's a lot of times that I brought in something that I think is fascinating that 15-year-olds do not care about. They just don't. And then there's other times that I will bring in a throwaway text that I'm like, I don't know, there's so much about the music here. Can we like pull it up on YouTube? And, I think that, yeah, a lot of my teaching is very much driven by trying to find at least a short primary source to go with whatever article or excerpt that I'm reading or assigning. So far, I've been in institutions where people do the reading. We will see once the classes get bigger how that evolves. But yeah, I also think that no, I think I'll leave it there. Yeah, thank you.
More questions from our Zoom audience, or can I turn it to our actually existing audience?
Yep, we got one.
I had a question.
Go ahead, please.
Hi, Becky. This is a wonderful presentation, and I'm recently learning about feminism in Nancy's class of 8100, and some of the articles that we read and the discussions that we did on the class were like very interesting. I just wanted to know the time period that you're talking about is early 1900, early 20th century. I think it falls into the first wave of feminism. But when we're learning about feminism, I think the first wave of feminism was mostly focused on white women's rights and their political powers and stuff. But this actually, like, do you think this movement falls within that period of feminism, and does it have any impact on gaining political powers? For example, does this movement or these activities lead to women getting the right to vote in the future? Does it have any connection?
Thank you. And I think that that's a really, really interesting question. And I mean, I know that like within feminist scholarship, gender studies, specifically coming from women of color, there's been a bit of like a lot of pushback against the kind of chronological waves within feminism. And so, some of the women who I'm writing about, Eslanda Robeson, also Amy Ashwood Garvey, Claudia Jones, like from the 1920s, they're already thinking about critiques of labor and capitalism. They're thinking from the perspective of women who are doing underpaid, hyper-exploitative domestic workers, rather than women who are trying to find a place in the workforce, like Black women have always been. But then they're also making these direct connections, pushing back against some of the Black nationalist movements at the time, because it's like in a lot of anti-colonial and anti-racist organizations, it's always like the narrative of we have to put the race first, and then gender, and then sexuality. And you can see that same thing through the civil rights movement, but throughout the 20th century, and arguably, even before, if we think about the writings of somebody like Ivy Wells, there's always that sort of interconnected, we have to understand the interconnections of race, class, gender, nationality, sexuality at the same time, and from specifically like a working class perspective. So I mean, I do think that, I wouldn't say that you could make a direct lineage connection between some of these women that I'm writing about and the right to vote, for example, but they certainly have critiques of the limits of suffrage, right? The kinds of compromises of strategically excluding women of color, thinking about kind of like the overlaps between eugenics and white women's suffrage movements, and thinking, I think, more broadly about, like a true politics of global liberation that's challenging nationalism and like thinking about these different issues. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that reading through women of color feminism and some of those edited collections through these longer histories, some of the periodization falls apart a little bit. So I hope that that's helpful. And if you email me, I'm happy to share some short readings on some of these issues of linking offhand of some texts that I definitely have them in my report. Thank you. It's a really great question.
Thank you very much.
We have more questions from the Zoom audience. I think I might turn the questions to us. I have a question, but what about anybody else in the audience? Ariel, I'm sorry, please.
Hi, thank you so much for this really fascinating talk. I also can't wait to read your book. I have, lots of thoughts, but I guess just was wondering if you could say more about the connections today to like Black Lives Matter, thinking about pathways of politicization and how I was thinking how much the kinds of movements you trace, right, are linked to mediums that are historically specific too, right? And so as thinking with the way that those mediums are different today, and how that kind of or what the links are in terms of how you're thinking about those pathways of movements and how those are part of politicization processes for Black Lives Matter.
I guess I could have just stayed here. You're right. We still have more than half an audience. Yeah, so the question was about the connections between this previous historical period that I'm reading or that I'm researching and contemporary Black Lives Matter movement, and also to think about the historical specificity of the media. So the newspapers, the kind of sitting around waiting, discussing, and how that maps onto the present. And so, I mean, I think that, one of the things that got me thinking about the historical underpinnings and some of the connections to contemporary Black Lives Matter movements was just like reading some of the studies, like I'm thinking about Barbara Ransby's book, for example, Making All Black Lives Matter. And so often in some of these books that are definitely grounded, like Barbara Ransby's been hugely involved in some of these these activists, and a lot of activism around Chicago, through different organizations. But I think that there's like a tendency within some of these studies to kind of gesture to global solidarity without really unpacking the nuances. So for example, the sort of reports of delegates from New York spent 3 weeks in Johannesburg and like, in the townships, they debated and they discussed it. It's like, but what did they debate and did they discuss? And, are the lived experiences, are the structures of anti-Blackness like similar? Are they shared across those spaces? What are the differences? How do some of these different histories and categorizations of race and racism kind of, like how is the narrative of Black Lives Matter in the US like confronted, contested, challenged through some of the global connections or encounters? And I think that, I found that in a lot of that literature, the kind of unpacking was a little bit unsatisfactory, just in the sense of like, we know that there are ties, we know that there are delegations, but in terms of like, how are these categories, how are these histories, how are these strategies of things that, don't always map onto one another, like reworked through the kind of transnational perspective? Like, is it a throwaway global because Black people are oppressed in different places, or is there a kind of strategic reworking of categories? And so, I don't have the answer per se, but I do think that some of these, I hope that some of the like more biographical, in-depth studies of how people shift understanding of racism, their political consciousness, their experience really shift through movement, kind of can open up a framework for how we might ask those questions differently of today. And so, I don't think that, people are not reading the newspaper or that kind of circulation in the same way, but there's still, a similar attentiveness to what the experience is that shape and inform the people's lived reality, like whether it's a debate that's happening now on Twitter versus in a grocery queue, like what are the kinds of questions, experiences, orientation, and how can we learn from the past rather than from the technology itself.
I have a question, May. It was a great talk, thanks so much. And I guess it's kind of related, but I'd like to ask you about the relative, subversiveness of what you're talking about, or perhaps the marginality of what you're talking about. What occurred to me is that twice in your talk you referred, there's Italy features, and it features because Amy Ashwood Garvey standing in front of a group of people who were protesting. The caption there, protesting the fascist invasion of Ethiopia in 1936 and 35. And then you mentioned Italy again, Frozen. And so, the fascist invasion was completely unproblematized in the United States. Industrialists were falling over themselves to embrace it. And even the Jewish diaspora had embraced it because the Italian fascists were using the Jewish diaspora to move around the Mediterranean, right? And so it's really non-normative, this collection of sort of Black radical, anti-fascist sociality that you're sort of talking about. Or am I mistaken? Is it sort of more, it's a bigger and more massive than that? So how marginal is it at this point?
So like Robin Kelly has a really great chapter where he talks about the Abraham Lincoln Brigades. So African-American sailors or soldiers who made their way to Italy. And actually there were a few thousand who actually fought in that war. And it was interesting because it was no, sorry, that's Spain. Also marginal because they couldn't get to Italy to fight in the defense of Ethiopia. They couldn't get to Ethiopia, but then they went to Spain instead as a kind of proxy, which again is something that, is completely erased from like US history, political imagination, another one that went way under the radar at the time. So, I mean, I think like Dave Featherstone has a piece that is also talking about Black solidarity in the defense of Ethiopia. I mean, and it definitely, like, I remember Robin Kelly, because he does talk about that as a sort of global symbol of like turning point in the Black political imagination. So, I mean, there's all kinds of political protests throughout London, throughout New York, throughout the Caribbean. There's work stoppages. And actually, what I didn't talk about in this paper, in this presentation, was how many dock workers strikes from Durban, from Cape Town, from San Francisco, I believe in Greece, Black dock workers, and sometimes white allies, some people who were not Black, like refused to ship arms, munitions, food supplies to Italian troops in India. And there's some pieces about that that are reported in the International African Opinion, in the Nuclear Worker. So even if it isn't like a full work stoppage, the fact that there were like 30 to 40 ports around the world at different moments that were like sometimes very successful, and sometimes it was, like having 20 or 30 guys walk off the job. That certainly it had much more oppression in place in the Black political imagination at that time than it has certainly not been historically remembered as that formative. That was actually one of the first things that I found most exciting when I started this project, and then it kind of comes in and out as a vision that was something that stood out. But I think that like part of what the maritime approach does, because it's like the kind of anchoring for each of the chapters is that in some way they're routed through London, but it crosses all kinds of imperial, colonial, racial borders in a way that, like isn't really done that often. And I think that thinking about the Oceanic allows us to do that, but it's very much like, there are studies of French imperialism in the Caribbean, in Africa. There's like the British Empire, South Asia, Africa, but it's like rare to have these kinds of interconnections. And I think because seafarers are constantly having to negotiate, like, okay, I'm gonna make more money if I get on an American ship, so let me jump ship here. Oh shit, the French have changed their nationalization policy, I'm not gonna be able to get hired. Oh man, we gotta stay out of like British controlled ports. And so it's like really interesting to think about the implications for borders, for mobility.
Question that's directly related to the question of the oceanic and the maritime, and the extent to which the environment itself plays a role. And I've been thinking about maroons and maroonage in the ways in which people are talking for a while have known, but then in geography taking up these ideas about the unruly landscape itself, the swamp and the mountain. And I'm wondering if the oceanic space matters. And then people are thinking about that kind of like Black ecological knowledge or Black ecologies. I don't know if that makes a difference here either.
I mean, I think so. Like, I mean, some of it is like the port districts are kind of historically known as kind of meeting place where there's all kinds of workers who are passing through on ships. And I think a lot about Julia Scott's book, The Common Wind, on the Haitian Revolution. Thinking in really interesting ways about the communication network across islands. And it's interesting because like the navigational knowledge and the access to the small boats and how to maneuver the swamps is so important as well. But then there's also just like you'll see all of these pieces of legislation where like British and French colonial administrators like are aware that the small boats and the water workers are, it's to some extent facilitating practices of marinage in these subversive communities. But then like, yeah, but we don't have the resources and like it's not actually worth our time. So they sometimes, you know, go along and engage in treaties in all these different ways, but then there's ways that, you know, like colonial officials are just constant. Like, and you know, it's funny like to think about like, you know, how many, like there'll be thousands of pages on a topic and it's like, it's just not right. Which, you know, this is always a little funny. But I mean, I think that the ship is interesting for, it's interesting for a few ways. And so like in Amir Khan's memoir that I talked about a little bit, Jump Ship in New York, there's other chapters where he's talking about memorizing songs that are basically political propaganda. But this idea that there are certain ships where they know that they're not going to be able to take these materials, they're going to be confiscated by the ships, but there is the little bit of time in between shifts where you can memorize the songs and then, you know, share the stories, meet with the people, meet with the intermediaries, the port districts. And so in some ways, like the ship does provide that solitude, but then it's like, it's hard to not romanticize, you know, because it's like, yeah, people die. And, you know, you spend a lot of time burying your friends and never quite healing from wounds. And, you know, the same person after the first voyage to sea spent 3 months in a hospital in Mumbai recovering from just the damage of being, you know, undernourished, overworked for a year. So, I mean, I think that, you know, in some ways there are examples of collective study groups happening in the bunks and people signing petitions and then they pass out in the different ports. But then there's, you know, like just the constant tension. But I think that, you know, what I didn't want to do was to overly romanticize, right? Like there are some people who in their memoirs or in their archival papers will talk about, you know, having time to read Marx on a ship. And you're like, wow, like that is one image and like that's an experience. So it's not to be like, no. But not everybody had time to read Marx. Not everybody was memorizing. Not everybody was always together, but I think the fact that there are these possibilities and that they were, you know, part of people's lives and stories. And sometimes it wasn't even like, oh, we were reading these great treatises. Sometimes it was like, you know, like most of the seafarers in this story in this period did not grow up near the docks, right? Like most Indian seafarers were dispossessed peasants who didn't have a choice but to take a chance at a life at sea. And that's true with a lot of workers from the US South, from rural communities and across these places. And so some people, like, they saw the ocean for the first time before they got on the ship. And so there's a lot of care work of like, okay, this is when you need to eat. This is how you need to rest. This is how you need to move your body in order to survive this. And it's like, obviously not to say that everybody who did survive did learn, but there's like this very sort of how to get like survival level care, intimacy, support for one another. That's also really important to the story. And I mean, I think that that is something that is like uniquely facilitated through the ship and also through some of the labor halls, some of the living rooms, and some of those spaces on land as well.
My question is like so tiny after what you just said, but I was going to ask about the intimacy of ship life and particularly the homosexuality of ship life. But you kind of already got it with what you just said to Becky. But I'm curious. I know we're out of time, but what of that kind of practice and knowledge then went back to the people who were disseminating the brochures and the kind of the higher level political thinking, because, you know, you see them using the sailors as transit and having conversations, but what were they learning? Were they evidencing learning about that kind of male intimacy from the ships into their political thinking? Do you see what I'm asking?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to say no. I mean,
Well, that's a great short answer
Yeah.
for the end of the talk.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I want to say, you know, like as time goes by, like, you know, when I'm looking through drafts of like the Communist International Archives and stuff, like there is a bit more detail over time to like the details of like who might, you know, like what kinds of people might be part of this, or like, oh, like these kinds of intimacy, or not intimacy, intermediaries. But it's very much at the level of like this shopkeeper, these seafarers. And so it's like still, you know, in some ways it's like my project is trying to challenge this, you know, functionalist utilitarian, like the seafarers are just distributing. But I actually don't think that, you know, I don't think like when he was meeting with Claude McKay and Otto Huswald and some of these first Black seafarers who made it to the Communist International. Like, I don't think that the strategies that they, because like networking among seafarers was written into all of these draft documents, right? And it's like very detailed, and I don't think that it would have looked the same in terms of the text if it hadn't been for the experiences that Huswald and McKay and Floyd had at sea, in terms of like detail orchestration. But I also don't think that, you know, but it's like those kinds of levels of detail also weren't there. You know, it's like they might have come up in the strategy, in the conversation, but they were not reflected in the text per se.
Thanks, Faye. I think I'm gonna end it there. This is 5 o'clock. We have a Zoom clap and an in-person clap. Thanks, everybody.
That's what girl does, get it.